At 8:15, the little diner on the corner smelled like fresh coffee and fried onions, as it always did. Light slanted through the blinds in thin, patient bars. The clock above the counter ticked with the steady certainty of something that had been done for years and would be done again tomorrow. Walter Branson slid into his usual booth, the one by the window that had softened to the shape of his back. His hands, marked by the small tremor of age and the thin white thread of a scar across the knuckle, cupped the chipped mug as if it were a compass. He had fought in a war people now remembered in fragments. He kept to routines the way some people kept prayer. A flannel shirt, a coat hung on the same peg, the same seat at the same time. The waitress, a young woman who had learned to read his silence as well as his order, placed his coffee without a word and left him with the radio's low hum and the clatter of spoons and plates. The calm there was felt by everyone in the room, like an agreement. Patrons read papers or scrolled at their phones. The cook called out a ticket. Conversation was small and practical. The weather, a game on the radio, the slow work of an ordinary morning. Then a voice cut across the hum, loud, impatient, the kind of voice that fills a room not to be heard but to be feared. A young man at the counter argued with the waitress, all bluster and breath, fingers tapping the formica like a demand. He leaned too far into her space. When she stepped back, startled and pleading, he rolled his eyes and snapped something cruel. Walter did not see the words at first. He saw the movement. The man's hand rose, a sharp, impulsive motion. There was a particular horror to seeing aggression aimed not at a rival, but at someone who is smaller in the moment, the way it transforms a public space into a private injury. The slap landed on the side of Walter's face with the soft, absurd sound of a newspaper hitting a cheek. Cups stuttered on saucers. Forks stopped midair. The diner inhaled. Silence flooded the room like a physical thing. Faces turned away to avoid the weight of what they'd seen. People shifted in their seats. Some pretended the incident did not concern them. The waitress stood frozen, one hand to her mouth. She mouthed apologies to Walter that had no sound. Walter's face did not collapse into theatrics. He blinked. His jaw tightened. The dignity that had carried him through years of harder things sat there like armor. He touched his face with the back of his hand, felt the sting, and then something else, an ancient ache that was less about the skin and more about being seen that way. Time slowed. Minutes stretched into small eternities where action could have changed everything and did not. Bystander paralysis is a quiet violence. It says, in effect, that comfort is worth more than courage. The young man's sneer swelled into triumph.
He added words to the assault, mocking, petty, and for a moment it seemed the room might accept this new small hierarchy. Then the bell over the door chimed. It was not a cinematic entrance. There was no crash of thunder, no spotlight. The door opened and a group of riders stepped inside, boots damp from the morning, the faint iron scent of exhaust clinging to leather. The diner registered them the way a body registers a sudden intake of air, with immediate, unclanned attention. Leather jackets edged the doorway like shadows that had learned to stand still. Chrome glinted on handlebars tucked by the door. They moved with the easy confidence of people who have spent years traveling together, who know how to read one another across a crowd. The room shivered with expectation. At the center of that line, scanning slowly, was a man who took the space of a leader without demanding it. His beard had more gray than black now, salt threaded through like wisdom on a rope. A line of old sunburns scarred his knuckles. His eyes traveled the room the way a man looks over a map he knows by heart. He paused when they reached Walter, and something in his posture altered, a catch, almost imperceptible, that the camera of the mind would later linger on. He crossed the floor, and instead of drawing a circle of protection around himself, he moved straight to the booth and sat down opposite Walter without fanfare. He did not take off his jacket. He did not touch his helmet. He reached out, and with a hand that had held handlebars, and perhaps a child's wrist before, covered Walter's tremulous fingers. For a single second it was only a private gesture. Then the man spoke, and his voice filled the diner in a way thunder never could. Calm, measured, carrying the kind of authority earned by weather and time. He said one word, "Dad," and it landed like a small, honest bomb. Faces in the room shifted from watchfulness to disbelief. The young man at the counter laughed at the coincidence, what he thought was a show, but the laugh died before it left him. Recognition is a different kind of reveal than any other drama. The patrons could see it on Walter's face in the same way they had seen his stoicism before, the twitch at the corner of an eye, the slight parting of lips that holds a memory. Thomas Branson, the leader among these riders, had been a ghost in Walter's life for years, an absence with a shape. The diner, a stage for small-town routines, became something like a family home expanded to include an audience. Whispers laced the room. The young thug's smirk faltered. The dynamic that had felt so imbalanced moments before now shifted, because a new weight had entered, not muscle alone, but history and possession. Thomas did not rise to menace. He did not clench his fists. He rested his calloused palm on Walter's hand and said nothing at first, letting the contact speak. The thud of the room's silence resumed, only now it contained the expectation of accountability.
Then Thomas looked at the young man and named what everyone had seen, but framed it in a way that left no room for bravado. "You hit him," he said simply. "You hit my father." It was not a proclamation for the camera. It was an exacting statement that carried the simple logic of relationship. A boy of 20 couldn't change the fact of being wrong by shouting louder. Thomas's presence was a non-violent dominion. His unspoken network of loyalty and witness circled the room like an invisible fence. The other riders arranged themselves without theatrics. No threats, no swagger, just the sober solidarity of men who had chosen to be accountable to one another. Their silence was its own kind of force. The young man's bravado broke like thin glass. He tried to make it into a joke, to shrug off the accusation, to avoid shame with noise. But the look on Thomas's face denied the option. There was recognition there of how ugly cowardice can look and the shame it ought to bring. The thug's breath hitched. His eyes darted to the door, then to the faces around him, faces that had earlier averted their gaze, now fixed on him. The room held him under the simplest spotlight, a chorus of witnesses. Pride is brittle under such scrutiny. He stepped back, muttered something about not wanting trouble, and left, the bell over the door marking his exit with the same indifferent chime that had announced the biker's arrival. He left not because he had been beaten, but because he felt exposed. Humiliation can be a kinder teacher than force. The exhale that followed felt like rain after heat. Conversations restarted like small streams after a dam opens. The waitress moved like a woman who had been woken from a nightmare. She refilled Walter's coffee with hands that trembled differently now, this time from relief. People apologized, awkward, belated, but real. A man at the counter dropped a folded bill on the table and said, "On the house," and the cook offered a slice of pie with the kind of small generosity that stitches things back together. Thomas finally removed his hand from Walter's and leaned close, his tone soft enough for only the two of them. He didn't speak of blame or the long years that had kept him apart. He offered something simpler, an acknowledgement and a present-tense promise. "I'm here now," he said, "if you'll have me." Walter's reply was a laugh that held a few tears and as many forgiven winters. "I've always had you," he said, which was both true and untrue and exactly enough. The presence of the biker group changed more than the thugs' plans that morning. It changed the tone of the diner. People who had sat apart in polite silence found themselves leaning into conversation about small things that mattered. The war stories Walter never wanted to burden anyone with, but which suddenly, in the right light, were safe to mention. The son who had once left and then returned in a way that cost them both. The riders accepted coffee without ceremony.
They treated Walter with a fast, blunt respect that had nothing to do with danger and everything to do with choice. For them, a man who had stood for something once was worth the courtesy of attention. For the diner, the booth by the window became a place where the community met its conscience and decided, together, to behave a little better. In the days that followed, Walter's seat at 8:15 was no longer a solitary ritual. Thomas came, sometimes with others from the group, sometimes alone. He sat then with a gentleness that replaced the old distance. He listened when Walter spoke about places on maps he had never been, and he told the stories he had carried too, the reasons for leaving, the impossible smallness of excuses, the long work of making amends. The stall of silence that once sat between father and son eroded under the steady action of showing up, the slow building of trust that isn't dramatic but is durable. The diner changed too, in small public ways that don't make the news but are the quiet work of community. People began to notice. They nodded to the veterans who came in. They remembered names. They offered help when it was needed, and they felt less comfortable looking away. The memory of that morning, the slap, the hush, the bell, the entrance, settled in as something instructive rather than merely startling. It taught the town what it costs to watch and the value in human currency of presence. There was a moment, months later, when someone asked Walter why he kept coming back to that same booth. He smiled, tracing the worn edge of the formica with a finger. "Because," he said, "sometimes the things that keep you going are small. A hot cup, a clock that always runs, the chance to sit and be seen." Thomas reached across and touched his father's hand, the calluses and scars aligned like a map. The clock on the wall read 8:15. Out in the street, the Ridge Riders, so named because they had once traced a mountain road together and never quite stopped, parked their bikes with a quiet pride that was not about intimidation, but about belonging. They had come this time for a man and left with a story that didn't need retelling. The thug had learned an expensive truth, that public cruelty is fragile when confronted by steady dignity and the quiet weight of community. If you believe in standing with those who served, hold on to that feeling and carry it with you in the small choices you make each day. Have you ever witnessed someone step in with words instead of fists and change everything? Share your story below.